Lava bending is a mixture of earth bending and water bending principles.
Okay, this theory actually makes a lot of sense, but we're going to have to talk about it first. Now, I'm pretty sure Roku was the first one that we ever see lava bending, but then we see Avatar Kyoshi doing it, and it was originally believed to be a combination of earth bending and fire bending. And not only was this the prevailing theory, but in Avatar Extras, it was revealed that lava bending was a combination of earth bending and fire bending. So this was technically canon for a while, but I like this idea a little bit better. So originally it was thought that only avatars could do this because it wasn't just the philosophies, but it was literally fire and earth combining to create this new skill. But it actually makes a lot more sense, especially after the retcon in Legend of Korra, that anyone with the right philosophy could do this just like lightning bending. And who's been spending a lot of time with people who can bend water? Bolin. Could it be because he has a firebender and earthbender as parents? That is what I thought at first, but I changed my mind, and I'll tell you why. So before Ghazan and Bolin, the only people to ever bend lava on the show were avatars, and it was explicitly stated in Avatar Extras that this was intended to be simultaneously bending fire and earth at the same time, but that was retconned the moment that Ghazan came on screen. So at first I thought the answer was pretty obvious, like you do here, that it's just because he has an earthbender and firebender parent, but that doesn't really seem to be how genetics work in the Avatar universe, and that would kind of make the Avatar less special, because then you have a bunch of sub-avatars running around just because they have mixed parents. And once you think about what he's doing, he's not really creating any flames so much as he's changing the state from liquid to solid, solid to liquid. And there is another bending style that we see doing that, water bending. So it's less of a combination of actual physical elements combining together and more of taking the bending philosophies from another bending style, because he's still only earth bending, but he's taking the idea that water benders use to change from ice to water or water to ice. He's just changing the state because it's still rock. He's not adding flames, he's not breathing fire or anything like that. He is simply changing the state of his element in the same way that a waterbender would. And keep in mind, he is a pro bender, he has been around waterbenders and firebenders a lot, and he has dated a waterbender and has had a crush on and been very good friends with the Avatar, who is first and foremost a waterbender, as she is from the Water Tribe. As much as I didn't like the concept of lava bending being an earthbender thing at first, I think I've kind of grown to like it once I view it this way, simply because it really seems to break the lore of Avatar a little bit less than it just being a combined form of bending, because it makes it a little more accessible and a little more philosophical, just like the show. So anyway, what do you think? It shouldn't be possible to lava bend without both elements. So like I said in my most recent video, that was kind of the visceral reaction I had when I first saw Ghazan lava bending, because it's like, no, that's only something the Avatar can do. But even then, when you think about how firebending works, they are producing flames, producing fire. Even when they're heating up their breath, you can even see bits of fire coming out of Zuko's nostrils as he's doing that flaming breath technique. And that doesn't seem to be what's happening here. Bolin is not creating fire to heat it up. Ghazan is not breathing fire or making fire to heat it up. He is changing the state in the same way that a waterbender would. So in this way, it does make a little bit more sense. And again, until yesterday, I had no idea this theory was out there. I would have absolutely agreed with you, but I've really turned to 180 in like a single day. So this commenter on my YouTube does make a good point. Not this one, but it is a little relevant. So here's the comment. It's a little long. Pause if you want to read. So he's absolutely right that there is a spiritual aspect to bending. That is actually what makes the Avatar able to bend all four elements. So why are we talking about genetics? What we need to understand first is what we're talking about. We have two competing theories. One is that it's a combination of earth and fire bending parents, and the other is that it is a philosophical or stylistic evolution of the craft of earthbending. Now, it's important to note that neither has been dismissed or confirmed in canon, so these are both fan theories, meaning that any changes later on could conceivably make one or the other the correct option. While one option is basically only based on a single character, Bolin, the other is established lore. We know that this is a thing. This is what led to redirecting lightning. So if bending is inherently spiritual, why are we talking about genetics? Well, on the one hand, there's an obvious genetic component, meaning that some people simply are not born benders, and no amount of spiritual enlightenment will make you a bender. We know that for certain it comes from lineage. It also means that if this wasn't the case, if the genetics did allow for mixing of bending, then one, we would have already seen it, at least in the 100 Years' War, if not some point in the history, and you would have had a bunch of like sub-avatars just running around. And that would make the Avatar inherently less special and wouldn't really jive with the spirit of the show. Could it be a change that they make down the road? Absolutely. Again, these are both fan theories, and neither is directly excluded by the lore, but one certainly fits with the spirit of the show just a little bit better, doesn't it? Oh my god, this is it. This is exactly what I was looking for. I've been trying to come up with a theory on how exactly the genetics work in Avatar, and this right here was the piece I was missing. So the way I see it, there has to be two kinds of genes. A gene that is just like a predisposition to being a bender, and a gene that affects what element that you can bend. So if you have the fire gene but not the bending gene, you're not a bender, but you can pass on the element of fire to your children. Similarly, if you have no elemental gene but you do have the bending gene, if you marry someone who does have an elemental gene, then your child could be a bender of that element. So this is what I think happened with the new airbenders, is they had the bending gene but no elemental gene, and this is where this comment comes in. I made the mistake of treating this like genetics in our world, but what if in their world there's regular genes but there's also genetic chi? That would start to make a lot of sense. So now we can say your physical genes will determine whether or not you can become a bender, but your spiritual genes, your genetic chi, will determine what element you bend. And it really does still seem like only one can be passed along, and maybe that's because when mixing, when one overtakes the other, it simply fleshes the rest of the chi out or converts it all into the same kind of chi. We really don't know. But with no elemental chi of their own, any chi coming from the harmonic convergence could overwrite, and I can't remember if any other bending styles appeared after harmonic convergence, or if it was just the airbenders, or if we only really followed the airbenders because that's what was important. But I think that's what happened. They didn't have an element to their chi, and so it was overtaken by the spiritual energy from harmonic convergence. It's all coming together, baby. Okay, solid point I did not think about at all. So while it's not explicitly stated, and we never see their mom that I know of in a situation where she would have to bend, I think it's pretty much implied that neither of them was a bender. So that does throw a wrench into this whole theory a little bit. Now, I love Legend of Korra, but this is one of the recurring issues that it has. It has some very inconsistent writing. It creates a lot of problems for anyone who wants to establish like a solid lore for it, and it really just doesn't have the same kind of philosophical or spiritual impact that the original does. So if we want to stay consistent with the lore, that leaves us only three options. Option 1, I'm just totally wrong, end of story. Option 2, the bending gene is maybe recessive, but if that were the case, I feel like there would be a lot fewer benders than we see in the shows. Option 3, one or both parents was a bender, it just never came up in the story, but again, that just points back to bad writing. So over the last few days, I've been making some videos about lava bending and how it works and what evidence we have for why it works that way. Now, one thing that I mentioned was that firebenders really seem to only be able to produce flames. Even when we see scenes like Iroh heating up his handcuffs in Book 1, we can kind of infer, especially seeing Zuko later use a flame breath technique to keep himself warm, that he's probably just creating fire in his nostrils and creating hot air around that. Or at least that's what I thought. But I totally forgot that there was one single scene in the original show where something that was not fire was absolutely being bended by a firebender, and that's this scene right here. Did you see that? You can tell that Sozin is just straight up bending the hot air or the smoke or whatever that is supposed to be without producing, creating, or manipulating direct flames. And is that the lightning redirection stance? So a few people in my comments section have pointed to Poi and Ping from the Fortune Teller episode when we talk about genetics, because they are twins, but one is an earthbender and the other is a non-bender. So does this ruin the whole theory? So not necessarily. The way we're looking at it through this theory is that there is the physical genetics that determine whether or not you have the predisposition to be a bender. So in this case, both of them should have that same bending gene. And then you have the spiritual aspect, that genetic chi, which would come from one or both parents. So obviously, as twins, they have the same physical genetics, but that doesn't mean they have the same chi. That doesn't mean they have the same exact balance of life forces. And it has to be hereditary in some form or fashion, because we don't see any earthbenders being born in the Fire Nation, where there are no earthbending parents to give birth to earthbending children. Okay, let's take a step back for a moment. A few days ago, I stitched a video talking about this new theory that I was just introduced to by Nikhil Clayton about lava bending, and it kind of ended up morphing into this conversation about almost a grand unified theory of bending, and I think we might need to take a step back. Now, like a lot of you, I got into Avatar initially because of the fantasy elements, the action, the martial arts, but I stayed for the philosophy. I think what really made a lot of us truly fall in love was the philosophy and the spiritualism of the original show. And as much as I do love The Legend of Korra, I think we can all agree it does have some writing issues. When you have the introduction of non-avatars being able to bend lava, or the introduction of Rava as the avatar spirit, we are talking about changes that don't necessarily mesh with the original spirit of the show. We've been getting very technical and very scientific about the things that we're talking about, and I think we may have gone a little too far. Because when I talk about the spirit of the show, it's much like the Force. In the original trilogy, we get this kind of Taoist, mystical sense to what the Force is. It's not fully explained. Whether you like the overall concept of midichlorians or not, it did change the spirit of the film. And no matter how much real science we put into this, there is a limit, I think, to how much of that is actually true in the show. Keep in mind, we're still talking about a system of magic, right? So while I do enjoy occasionally going full MatPat and going overly literal on everything we're talking about, I think if we want to think about what is true within the universe of Avatar, we have to put a limit on how scientific we get with that. And the answers I'm probably going to be more at home with are ones that fit within the spirit of the show. So I guess we'll see how it goes. I have made some mistakes. So many of you have joined me in my journey to find the grand unified theory of bending in Avatar: The Last Airbender, but I must admit I have goofed. I have been making a lot of factual errors and missed things that were either in the shows or, I'm going to be honest, I have not read the comics, so anything that y'all are saying from the comics is mostly new to me. But I've been forgetting things or getting things wrong, so there's only one solution to this. I guess I'm going to have to watch Avatar: The Last Airbender again. Woe is me. How terrible. And we have to be thorough, so I'm going to watch all of Avatar: The Last Airbender and all of Legend of Korra, so this is going to take me some time. Also, let me know in the comments, are the comics good? Should I read them too?
Isn't metal just earth?
Yes, this was my exact take when I saw that episode for the first time. Like, it's just earth, and like he says in the original video, we see people not just bending dirt and rocks, but also sand and crystals. Even Guru Pathik literally says that metal is earth, it's just been refined. This is one of the main reasons why I don't think we should get too scientific with what we're talking about. Maybe I'm not remembering Guru Pathik's explanation very well, but it's possible that by seeing these particles of earth, Toph isn't bending the particles of earth within the metal itself, but she is bending the metal, it's just harder than regular earth. So maybe it's the fact that it is refined and that it has been morphed and warped by human hands that makes it more difficult to bend. If they're just bending particles of earth within the metal and not bending the metal itself, then how are they getting such fine control of those lines? And if you have to sense it every time, why aren't they using seismic sense literally every time that they're metal bending? As I'm rewatching the show, this take might change because it might solidify the explanation in the show. I might not be remembering this very well. But here's the thing. I think this has to do with the spirit of the earth more so than it has to do with science. And they are actually bending the metal. It's just more difficult because there is less of the earth's spirit in a refined form of it that has been changed by human hands. Because even if that isn't the canon explanation right now, it makes the most sense with how metal bending has been used since its creation. I got 10 minutes into episode 1 and I already had so many notes. For those who haven't seen my previous videos, I am rewatching all of Avatar: The Last Airbender so that we can try to figure out a grand unified theory of bending. We're doing this to refresh my memory, to find some new insights on bending, and to see if there's anything I didn't notice the first gajillion times I watched this show. And right off the bat, we're starting with something that I always noticed, but I never paid attention to, if that makes sense. Like, I was always distracted by Katara's big, over-the-top acting in this scene. But notice that even with the littlest motion she has, the water is still bending. Her anger is clearly fueling her bending. She is bending without even meaning to, which is something I always attributed more to firebenders, but it seems that emotional content and drastic emotional states affect all benders. And this scene leads to my very next note. Where is this beam of light coming from? We don't seem to see it anytime Aang is in the Avatar state, and it's already glowing before the ice breaks. So my next thought is just pure speculation, but hear me out. So far as we know, just being frozen doesn't preserve you and keep you alive, even in the Avatar universe. We have never seen anyone else do this so far as I know. So if we're going with the idea that all of the elements have some kind of spiritual aspect to the extent of that's what determines what is or isn't earth, what is or isn't fire, etc., then maybe what's happening is this world chi, or this world energy, or elemental energy, is being stored through a long meditation while Aang is in the Avatar state for this 100 years, and that's what's keeping him and Appa alive. When the seal is effectively broken, Aang hasn't really mastered the Avatar state, nor does he need that energy to maintain his life and Appa's life anymore, so it just shoots off into the sky and dissipates back into the world. But again, that is just pure speculation. At this point, I really don't have any other evidence to really back that up. Yeah, this is going to take a lot of videos. I feel like we take this for granted sometimes, but Iroh is clearly not as matured here as he is by the end of the series. You can hear the frustration in his voice when he is trying to explain to Zuko how firebending works. Like, he's certainly wiser and closer to enlightenment than any of our other main characters at the beginning of the show, but he is still kind of a bitter, angry, slightly immature old man. I think it's the fact that he's maturing while everyone else is maturing as well, so as everyone else gets wiser and more mature, he still seems to be wiser and more enlightened than everyone else. But don't forget that he is a tired, cranky old man. He's most likely helping Zuko on this quest because he wants something that is easy, laid back, with little violence, where he can watch over Zuko, who he sees as a son, having lost his real one. He's got a long way to go, just like Zuko. And in this very same scene, he explains how firebending works, and this is going to be key to understanding bending for the rest of the show. He explains how when you breathe in, your breath becomes energy. That energy extends outwards and becomes fire. And if you don't think that sounds exactly like chi or ki, then I don't know what to tell you. In a way, we'll get to this at the end of the show, but it seems like all elemental bending is just an offshoot of energy bending, which lends credence to the idea that the world, the elements themselves, have a spiritual nature to them. And speaking of bending, let's talk about that sneeze. So about that sneeze. Seeing this scene again just really made me think, hilarious bending gags like Milo's fart bending from Legend of Korra has always been a part of airbending since episode 1. So for some people, it's not okay for Milo to do it, because that's just dumb. But when Aang does it, it's a classic scene that everyone remembers. On a more serious note, though, this is actually going to be important later, believe it or not. Another note I had around this same scene was the fact that Katara is only 2 years older than Aang, but she sounds so much more mature. I know it's pretty much only because that's just what her voice actress happens to sound like, but she sounds like a teenager. She sounds much older than she should, and it's almost as if she is audibly aged faster than she should have. But Sokka is both older and the de facto military leader of their entire village. Certainly he should sound like the older one, shouldn't he? So while Sokka is just off playing war, Katara is actually leading and maintaining the village itself, or at least that's maybe what it seems like. Also, I know it's just a visual gag more than anything else, but what are these staves made out of? For Aang to use so little air to bend the staff back toward him, is the wood itself and not just the cloth made for airbending? Is it a lighter wood? Is it made in a special way? Or is it just a gag? Because we do have to remember there is still a bit of cartoon logic in this show, and it's good to make sure we don't mix up cartoon logic with the actual lore. In part 2 of my Avatar review, I got quite a few comments like this one saying I misread Iroh's character, and they do make good points. So to everyone who did it respectfully, like this comment here, thank you so much for keeping me honest. What I got wrong is I went a little too hard. I kind of doubled down on the cranky aspect of Iroh, and I think that was a bit of a misread on my part, or at the very least, I misspoke. I do currently maintain that he is a broken character. He is still, for all intents and purposes, technically pro-Fire Nation at this point, and he is just looking for an easy job and a job that keeps him close to Zuko. He wants to protect Zuko and make sure that he can reach his full potential. As many point out in a lot of TikTok videos, as well as in the comments of this video, it probably wasn't until the slaying of the Moon Spirit that he started to change his tune. That's why I'm doing such a detailed walkthrough again in the first place, so if I'm wrong, we're going to see pretty shortly. You know, for everyone who complains that Legend of Korra had tech that was too advanced too fast, I feel like we're forgetting something. A bare minimum of 70 years before the Legend of Korra, we had steam-powered ships. What's really interesting about the Avatar universe is that it really seems like technology progressed at a much faster pace than you might expect because of bending. But with firebending and later on lightning bending accelerating the progress of technology, earthbending seemed to slow it down at exactly the same time. We'll see this more in Book 2 or even in the Omashu episode, but they don't really need technology when they can move trains with earthbenders. The train in Ba Sing Se is nothing more than a bunch of stone compartments that are then just pushed by earthbenders. But in the end, it'll all add up to this. But another thing I noticed but didn't pay attention to was how pale Zuko is. I know this is partly to make it very clear that he's the bad guy, the villain, but I think it's possible it might go deeper. I can't remember if Zuko was still this pale in the flashback, so we'll see when we get to that, but I have a feeling this has more to do with the fact that he spends more of his time in his private quarters than he does outside with the rest of the crew. He probably tries to meditate, he broods, he's angry, and he does not get along with nor want to have anything to do with the rest of the crew. So really the only time he's outside is when he is firebending training or looking for the Avatar. So either I'm looking too deep into it or they did a lot more visual storytelling than I even remember. We're finally on episode 2. Up to this point, Sokka's been doing a lot of talking and not a lot of showing that he is in fact a warrior. And this gear up scene shows he is taking this very seriously as the last warrior of the Water Tribe. But what I love is that right after they show Zuko gearing up, not just showing that both of them are getting ready, but that both are technically royalty. I feel like sometimes we forget that Sokka is in fact the son of the chief, and the chief is the head of the entire Southern Water Tribe. And it's not as fancy and it's not nearly as well fortified as the Northern Water Tribe, but that does still technically make him and Katara royalty. And despite Zuko being a firebender and having formal training, Sokka does not hesitate to be a one-man army attacking on behalf of the entire village. And even when he becomes quickly aware that he is completely outclassed by Zuko, he does not hesitate. He fires off his boomerang right away. This is the first time we see that it's not just lip service, he truly is a dedicated warrior. What he lacks in training, he absolutely makes up for in courage, intelligence, and adaptability. But in the end, it's still not enough. So when Aang shows up, Sokka doesn't just see that Aang is a strong bender, although of course he is. Aang is showing the courage to fight this enemy on his own just like Sokka. But what really opens Sokka's eyes is what happens next. Up to this point, Aang really hasn't been understanding what's been going on in the last 100 years. This is the moment that Aang's eyes are opened to the reality of what the Fire Nation has been doing. But while we don't see it here, this is the moment I think that Sokka also realizes what he's been ignoring as well. Some of you are very adamant Sokka and Katara are not royalty. I'll take a second to remind everyone this is why I'm going through the show again. I might have missed things, I might be remembering things wrong, so we're going through it step by step. So if I'm wrong, we'll find the exact time and moment that I find out I'm wrong. And after getting a number of comments saying that there were other water tribes, I really don't remember seeing that in the show, but again, I could be wrong. So I tried to look it up on the wiki, and from what I can tell, there were other tribes in the past, but from what the wiki's showing me, this tribe is all that's left of the Southern Water Tribe, at least so far as we can see. So either the wiki is wrong, I read it wrong, or this is still the only tribe left, which by default effectively, again, we're talking technicalities here, makes them royalty. But hey, if you stick around long enough, now that's a Freudian slip if I ever heard one. If you stick around here long enough, you might see me change my mind. We are still only on episode 2 and I still have so much to talk about. So whether or not I'm right about this being the last water tribe at the South Pole, we can still be sure about one thing. They were once a tribe with enough resources and enough people to not only build all these ships but man them and head out to sea. But all that's left for Sokka to defend is this. So we can see the weight of responsibility that Sokka has on his shoulders to defend what few people are left. So when Katara is trying to convince Sokka to go help her save Aang, Sokka is already packing the boat. That one act of self-sacrifice combined with the power and skill that Aang showed as well as his courage has driven Sokka to believe that this is the best way to protect his village. This isn't just a gag. Sokka has truly grown already as a character, and Katara is starting to realize that they're in this together, truly. And then this happens.
It's been so long since I've had hope.
She said the thing! For all the jokes and references to Katara always babbling on about hope, even in the show, Gran is the first one to actually talk about it in the show. And to be honest, I don't really remember Katara talking about hope that much, not to an extreme extent. Just to be sure, I'm going to start a counter the first time Katara ever talks about it, and we'll see how many times she says it by the end of the show. I told you this sneeze would be important. But just before we talk about that, I want to talk about this scene.
This staff will make an excellent gift for my father. I suppose you wouldn't know of fathers, being raised by monks.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. With his first thought being about his father, he is very clearly showing his main source of insecurity. And that's exactly why if you think arrogance is an overabundance of confidence, you're wrong. Arrogant people are not confident, they're extremely insecure. So they make this facade of confidence, but none of it's real. But not only is he insecure, he's incredibly ignorant of what a father really is. Because in the next episode and in The Storm, we're going to learn a lot about Aang's father figure, and just because they're not related by blood does not make him not a father figure. But on top of that, Zuko's real father figure is standing right there. With one line, in one scene, they have cemented exactly what Zuko's insecurities are all about, and this is only going to continue throughout the entire season. But Josh, why was this sneeze important? Why, thank you for asking. It is quite important. Airbenders clearly have a large lung capacity, but how is it that Aang is able to do crazy stuff like this? On the one hand, yes, they must just have larger lung capacity than the average person, that's clear. I just want to know how much air is actually going into his lungs, because it can't be the entirety of that blast. I know there's a fair amount of cartoon logic, especially in book 1, but is this cartoon logic, or is this actually an amount of air that he can breathe in with his lungs, or is he adding more air as he blows out? I'm genuinely curious. Tell me in the comments. Because this sneeze clearly was about to blast him off into space. In part 1 of my Avatar rewatch, I had a lot of comments trying to help me figure out what this beam of light is coming from. And my favorite comment was this one right here. I always assumed the light was from the buildup of energy he had to use in order to keep himself alive, early energy bending. And in that video, I talked about my working theory about how the elements have their own innate spiritual energy, and that Aang was absorbing this elemental energy from the water around him to keep him and Appa frozen in time. But I didn't say it was energy bending, nor was I even thinking that it was energy bending, even though what I described was clearly energy bending. But then I saw this beam of light watching DK Film Guy's review of Sozin's Comet, and do you see what that is? That's the same beam of light. And you know what scene that is? That's the energy bending scene. So that mystery's solved. So the only question is my working theory correct? Was he energy bending the elemental energy of the water around him? Or was he just bending the internal energy of himself and Appa? Oh, and that's not rhetorical, I'm genuinely asking. Okay, we're finally on chapter 3. So before we get into the story parts of this, can I just say I really wish we had more title cards like this. Like, look at that. That is gorgeous. And I get it, you know, they're chapter titles. It makes sense it would be on a white page, but look at that. Come on. Missed opportunity. I think this is a good time to point out something we take for granted as the audience. From Aang's perspective, it's only been like a few days since he last saw all of his friends. He has a very clearly sad look when he tries to justify his standpoint to Katara, but the part of him that's denying this is not just your run-of-the-mill denial. This is it has been 100 years since you've last seen these people. Even if the Fire Nation never made it there, they're probably all dead. And about that seal blubber jerky, see, when I was a kid, my brain heard jerky and thought, how flammable is that meat if they're using it for a fire? It just did not occur to my 12-year-old brain that blubber is a flammable substance. But also, if there's blubber jerky, that is very much 100% not firewood. Aang. Look, Aang, I know you're a vegetarian, but blubber is squishy. Where is the confusion, Aang? Zuko was a three-dimensional character from the start. Even just talking about Zuko's one-track mind about finding the Avatar, he is still showing a lot of depth. Let me show you what I mean.
If my father thinks the rest of the world will follow him willingly, then he is a fool.
Okay, obviously Zuko is still big angry. But he's also not wrong. And sure, he's being angsty, he's being immature, but he's not wrong. And he's showing that he is observant and, at least under the surface, empathetic. We'll see in the Storm episode this is exactly what gets him banished in the first place. But we can clearly see, under the arrogance, there is still that intelligent, empathetic kid that Zuko is. But right now, he's just showing that while he's trying to posture like Zhao does, instead of showing real confidence like Iroh. But that'll come later. Because if you want to talk about insecurities, Aang's got you covered. In this scene, Aang is literally visually confronted with the fact that everyone he has ever known is gone. This entire place is completely abandoned, and he knows what that means. It's not like he's so dumb or blind he hasn't realized. He has realized. He just doesn't want to admit it. Because to him, the moment he admits it, it's real. And we know most of that from his facial expressions. They could have just made him straight up in denial, but instead, they make it so abundantly clear that he knows he's in denial. He consciously is aware, but is making the conscious effort not to believe it. And to me, that's a lot more heartbreaking. So where exactly does the Fire Nation think the Avatar is? Take a look at this scene right here.
Did you really expect to? The Avatar died 100 years ago, along with the rest of the Airbenders.
Now, on the one hand, Zhao already suspects that he has some information on the Avatar and is just waiting for confirmation. He's just goading Zuko at this point. But that begs the question, what do most people think is going on with the Avatar right now? If the prevailing Fire Nation propaganda is to be believed, then he died 100 years ago. And that's probably one of the big reasons why they're going after waterbenders in the Southern Water Tribe so hard, is they know that one of the water tribes would have the next Avatar. But if they haven't found that Avatar in 100 years, where do they think the Avatar is? Do they think that Avatar died? Do they not know they're the Avatar? Are they in hiding? Like, what do they think? Speaking of questions I have no answers for, why is there a statue of Gyatso? Like, I get that he was a prominent master, but for air nomads to make a statue of Gyatso while he's still alive is a little strange to me. Maybe this is something I would understand if I read the comics, and believe me, I'm getting there, but what did he do that was so great that while he was still alive, they made a statue of him? These guys are monks. And I know it's mostly visual for Sokka and Katara to see what he looks like, so when they see Monk Gyatso's body later on, they know exactly who it is, but why is there a statue? Sokka is more than just the sarcasm and meat guy. We as fans, but also in the show, funnily enough, people have a tendency to take characteristics and traits that are symbolic of a person and make it their entire personality. Like, sure, Sokka's our fun-loving, cactus juice-drinking weirdo. But even in the first few episodes, we're getting the serious side to him.
You know, you can't protect him forever.
It's such a subtle line for someone who, even when he's serious, so often goes over the top and loud and voice crackly. But we have a tendency, because we love his sarcasm, we love his goofiness, sometimes we'll make that his entire personality, just like they did with the Ember Island players. And we kind of do the same for Iroh, but I'll get to that in the next video. Because while everyone else is trying to figure out who the Earthbender next to Roku is, I guess Avatar Kyoshi's over here? Okay, on a slightly more serious note.
You were a firebender? No wonder I didn't trust you when we first...
You know, as much as we talked about Sokka quickly realizing his mistakes, he is still trying to make excuses for why he didn't trust Aang. Come on, buddy. No one remembers Iroh correctly. If you look at my last video, we talked about how people don't really remember Sokka correctly either. That's kind of a spicy way of putting it, but I want to delve into why we remember characters incorrectly and why we get so defensive about it. because everyone's had their bout of misremembering someone or something and getting very, very emotionally attached to their version of it. So let me say it point blank right now. Iroh is not perfect, and his personal journey of growth is not at its completion in Book 1. We watch Iroh grow as a person and a character through all 3 books. His apotheosis is not until Book 3. So why do we remember things wrong in the first place? Here's a very oversimplified explanation. One of the prevailing hypotheses about memory is that you can only retain between 5 and 9 bits of new information at a time. That's why it's easier to remember phone numbers in sections of 3, 3, and 4 instead of all 10 digits run together. But basically, our brains are just lazy. Processing new information takes energy, changing your mind takes energy, and rerouting pathways in your brain takes a lot of energy. So whatever the number, it's understandable that we can only hold a certain amount for a certain period of time. But to save even more energy and more storage space, if you will, we go through another process before it is actually codified into memory. Depending on the information, depending on what your brain feels is most important, and depending on what takes the least amount of energy, you will either generalize, distort, or delete the information. That's why things like repetition and mnemonics are very important to actually accurately remember something. And the cherry on top is that memory is not a process of recollection at all. It's creation. A good analogy would be video compression. It's not saving every single frame of the video. It is saving patterns and data that can be extrapolated into the video afterwards. In the same way, we're only holding on to the bits of information that our brain deems important to remember the thing, which is a part of why we generalize, distort, or delete. When you remember something, you are creating a new image in your head. So when you remember people like Iroh, what's going to come to your head are going to be the things you most want to think about. And for us, that is his wisdom, that is his philosophy. We want to think of Iroh's wholesome, positive masculinity. But the more we do that without going back and rewatching like I'm doing with this series, we're creating a distorted image, a caricature of Iroh. And if you want a good example of distortion, there are people who remember that he was leading the siege of Ba Sing Se, but insist that he was, quote, a bystander. There's a comment on one of my previous videos that I think sums up how we view Iroh so perfectly. When comparing Iroh to other characters, the wisdom delta remains the same. So not only do we make a caricature out of characters like Iroh, but we also get very, very defensive about it. The reason we get defensive is, again, in an oversimplified way, we make certain memories or ideas or concepts part of our reality, of our worldview. Some things are just so intrinsic to the way that we look at the world that it's not just a thing that we know, it is a thing that is true about the world. So when that is challenged, we get very defensive because our very reality is being challenged, and that is a very disconcerting notion. Even if this aspect of reality that you're clinging onto is correct, it is very disconcerting to have someone give a completely different view of the very reality that you live in. This video is a bit more long-winded than I usually am, but I think in some of my videos I am trying to condense too much information into too small a time frame. Now, there's definitely times where I just straight up get things wrong, but sometimes I just misspeak because I'm trying to condense it so that it's a punchier, faster-paced TikTok and I'm not rambling. So if you made it to the end of the video, I usually keep my TikToks around 2 minutes, give or take a minute and a half to 2 minutes. If you want longer form content from me where I'm speaking a little bit more in depth about stuff, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to try and condense as much as I can without misspeaking. In Book 1, Chapter 3, we finally meet the single most important character in all of Avatar. Behold, Lord Momo of the Momo Dynasty. And you know what? No, I'm not joking. I genuinely believe, starting here at his very introduction, Momo is probably the most important symbolic character in the entirety of the franchise. They even basically say it outright in this very episode, but Momo is basically the symbolic representation of the Air Nation itself. And yeah, he's used for goofy gags like the chase between Sokka and Aang, but I think he's more than just comic relief. He is and always will be, from now until the end of the show, the representation of Aang's air nomad origins. His goofiness is a representation of the free-spirited nature of the airbenders themselves. But he's also shown to be quite vulnerable because he's just a little guy. And in that way, he kind of represents the non-violent, not necessarily pacifist, but non-violent philosophy of the airbenders. And I'm pretty sure his name came before the gag. They added this in later, but let's talk about Momo's name. If you haven't learned any Japanese, either from learning Japanese or watching anime, you might not know that a peach is called Momo in Japanese. And I think at least one of the writers knew this and was like, okay, let's have him eat a peach before Aang goes, I'll call him, Momo. I love when people weave in references and Easter eggs that most people just won't get, except for a select few, and those select few are going to feel so proud of themselves for noticing. I am getting a lot of comments like this one. So let me explain why Iroh's statue confuses me and why comments like this don't really answer my question. So first of all, just going off memory, but I don't think Gyatso was his teacher, he was just his friend while he was learning alongside him at the Air Temple. But I've got other comments just literally saying, well, he was friends with Roku, of course he gets a statue. Or he was a great master and people respected him and therefore he got a statue. But I don't think you're getting where my question is coming from. This is a monastery, and so the only reason to create statues is to commemorate, to leave an immortal reminder, and these are people who are not materialistic, so why would they make one while he's still alive? Because the only other statues that we ever see in any air temple are the Avatar statues. So did they make this after he died, in which case that kind of implies there were multiple attacks over a number of years against the air nomads? Or did he complete a great feat of mastery or something that led to him being commemorated like this? Because he's not commemorated as a young boy, which he was when he met Roku, he's commemorated as his old man figure. So did he accomplish some great feat? Did he create a new airbending form? Like, what did he do? I think that hopefully explains why he was just such a great guy. He was so cool. Like, that doesn't hold up for me, right? Because no matter what the answer is, if it was while he was alive or after he died, that has implications to it of information that we don't know right now about the Air Nation before and after its demise. Hopefully that clears that up, and hopefully some of y'all have some great ideas, because I don't know, I still have no idea. Okay, last video before we get to the Avatar State part of the episode. Many have pointed out that this is not Kyoshi. We know later on that Kyoshi is the Avatar just before Roku, but at the time of both writing and animating this episode, that wasn't cemented. And it's hard to tell from the angle, but I think it's this one here that's supposed to be the Earth Avatar before Roku. And there's a lot of debate on who that is, but guys, we already know. It's obviously Dwayne Johnson. On a more serious note,
Past lives? Katara, you really believe in that stuff?
for these first few episodes, they've really shown Sokka as very close-minded when it comes to bending and philosophical or spiritual things. But even though Katara is directly talking about the reincarnation of the Avatar, I love that Sokka's initial question is kind of implying that there's an idea that everyone possibly reincarnates. I mean, maybe I read too much into that, but it really seems like maybe the idea was that everyone kind of reincarnates, but the Avatar specifically always reincarnates in this specific cycle, and there's an Avatar spirit that can bend all four elements. I know this is later retconned to be Rava, which I think kind of negates the idea that normal people are just reincarnating, but maybe they are. But that was probably just more for exposition's sake than anything else. It has been so difficult to just not overthink things while also being as meticulous as possible and pulling out as much information as possible in this rewatch. We are finally going to talk about the Avatar State. For all the confusion I have about the actual lore reasons for the statue of Gyatso, I think I know the actual reason why it's there. Like I stated before, this is probably just so that Sokka and Katara know exactly who it is when they see Gyatso in this next scene. And last note before we get to the Avatar State, let's just talk about the fact that Gyatso absolutely pulled the air out of this room, because that is the only way I can see him and all the firebenders in the positions that they're in. And boy, is that a mental image. But right here is where my first question comes in. If the Avatar State is a defense mechanism, why is he going into the Avatar State now? I mean, it's obvious that his strong emotions are what is triggering it, but why? This is exactly why I need to point something out now, because this is going to be relevant through most of Book 1, and also, to a lesser extent, Books 2 and 3. Some lore or plot points, especially in Book 1, were retconned later on in the show. A lot of this wasn't completely planned out, or if it was changed later on. One obvious example is Kyoshi being the Avatar just before Roku, but us not seeing her statue in that position. Originally, Avatar was only supposed to have 13 episodes, but Nickelodeon added 7 more episodes to bring it up to 20 for Book 1. And this was while things were already animated, already written, and already voiced. Between that and the rule of cool elements that seem to permeate the series, especially in Book 1, it's going to be difficult to suss out what is just there for visual storytelling or because it's cool, versus what actually remains in the lore, especially as we go into later seasons when the lore becomes far more cemented. Which leads into my next very, very important question: why? Why do the eyes at all of the Avatar temples go off at this moment? It didn't go off when he was released from the ice and there was that big beam of light. It didn't go off when he went into the Avatar State later. What was the catalyst that made it such that all of the Avatar temples got involved in this too? And it can't be Rava, because that knowledge has been lost for centuries. And Rava also didn't exist at this point too. It seems to be implied that it's other avatars' personalities, maybe several at once, all at once, or one at a time, that are kind of taking control during the Avatar State. So it just kind of makes me wonder who's in control here. I don't know that for any particular instance we have any other evidence to go off of to answer that question of why the eyes are glowing. So I think the real answer might end up being this is just another rule of cool moment. Like, not only is it cool, but it drives the plot forward because now everyone knows that the Avatar is back. But there doesn't really seem to be a valid lore reason as to why, at least so far that I can see. In a novelization, you could describe what's going on, you could describe how Aang is feeling, but without a novelization, without the internal monologue, you just have the visuals. So do you think there's an actual lore reason for this, or do you think this is just for the visual storytelling? So while all of this is going on, Zuko's got something a little more personal going on. Zhao goaded Zuko and played on his insecurities, but kind of revealed his own insecurities. Like I said in a previous video, arrogance is not an overabundance of confidence, it is fake confidence to hide insecurities. Zhao continuously lusts for power and nothing is ever enough for him. And every time he gets more power or more success, he just wants to flaunt it over everyone. And while yes, Zuko is acting rashly, someone does need to show Zhao his place. Right out of the gate, Zuko is lashing out with his anger here. But he's also really trying to show off because he doesn't want to just win, he wants to show how powerful he is. Again, just like Zhao. Now, Zhao is a master with years of advanced training, and Zuko was so determined to get that advanced training. So he is trying to show the most advanced fighting that he knows. But to channel Iroh a little bit, without strong roots, even the tallest tree will fall. Because as much as Zuko is showing off, so is Zhao. So Iroh is reminding Zuko why it's so important to remember your basics. And even with Zhao overpowering and get the upper hand, you can see Zuko starting to go back to his basics. But this is the part I really wanted to talk about. Dante Bosco, the guy who voices Zuko, does breakdancing, and they wanted to kind of give him a little nod. So that's where this move comes in. This is the switch that flipped. He's not even firebending. The light bulb went off and he understands why the basics are so important now. But that is the same kind of move that was used in the final Agni Kai that everyone seems to be saying is an airbending move. Like, did we forget he did it here? But I do like the idea of him using other bending styles in his final Agni Kai, so when we get there, I'll kind of take another look at it. But he has done that exact move before. This may have started as Zuko lashing out and trying to show off, but he did learn a very important lesson that will stick with him for the rest of his life. Episode 4, and we're back to the plain white title cards. Like, I know at this point, it's iconic, it's classic, we know exactly what this style is, but you gotta admit, I would have loved to see just maybe a few more of those, you know? I like to think that this is Zuko actually learning something from the end of the last episode, but knowing the right direction to go obviously doesn't fix everything. Like, he's trying to meditate, but it's very obvious that this is not something he normally does. He noticed something to the effect of confidence and humility are similar and that meditation would probably help, but he's not quite there yet. I just also love the fact that despite knowing now that the Avatar is a child, they don't immediately go, oh, they have no idea where they're going. They're like, oh, he must be a master of evasive maneuvering. Like, I feel like at this point, Zuko just thinks that this guy is actually 100 years old and just looks like a kid. Like, he just cannot come to grips with the fact that his very destiny, the thing he needs to track down, the Avatar himself, who has been missing for 100 years, is just a goofy kid who doesn't know what he's doing. Let's talk about tech in Avatar. In a previous video, I talked about how it was possible, logically, for the technology in Legend of Korra to reach this level, but I didn't really talk about why a lot of us didn't like it when Korra came out. And I think I wasn't being extremely clear, so let me kind of clear this up a little bit. I didn't like it either. I was just talking about, logically speaking, this technology was possible or even probable in that 70-year span. The main issue a lot of us had or have is that it changes the vibe of the show. Avatar has really cool and interesting technology that utilizes bending in a lot of really interesting ways. But most of us did not fall in love with the series for the technology. We fell in love with the bending, with the martial arts, and with the philosophy, and you had this old world aesthetic to it. Like, there were even characters who were actively creating new technologies, just like the Mechanist. And Sokka was out there creating all sorts of new technologies. So while it's obviously silly to just assume that there would be little to no technological advancement in 70 years after the show, it still messes with that vibe. But over time, you could get used to that, and I kind of did about halfway through the first season. But then they doubled down. I can excuse a lot of what's going on with cars and, you know, the non-bending driven dirigibles and stuff like that, but mechs, not just mechs, but mechs made out of pure platinum. I will absolutely be getting to that in another video when I talk about metal bending, but really, and they didn't really use them all that much after season 1, so we kind of felt safe, right? And in season 2, they went a little more spiritual, and despite, again, a lot of writing issues throughout the entire show, which, again, a whole other discussion, you know, we felt safer. It was kind of getting back that vibe that it had lost due to this big leap in technology. And then, why? So again, I really do understand why a lot of people still to this day do not like the technology in The Legend of Korra and the implications that has for the next series. And I think you can tell at this point, I have a lot of problems with how this is portrayed, what the technology is like, and just the mechs. So what I was very poorly ragging on in that previous video was just the people who insist that it was impossible for them to get to that level of tech, because that's just not true, and that's not what the problem is. But it also reminds me of an issue that permeates the entirety of Legend of Korra, so we're going to talk about that in the next video. What makes something a filler episode? When Book 1 first aired, and even to this day, people insist that The Warriors of Kyoshi is a filler episode. And given plenty of scenes like this, I can understand why. But what is a filler episode? A lot of people seem to think that it's just anything that doesn't directly move the plot forward. On the extreme side of things, I've actually seen people argue that almost the entirety of Book 1 was nothing but filler episodes because they weren't directly getting them to the Northern Water Tribe. In this episode, we have Aang just kind of wanting to be a kid and enjoying being a celebrity. We have Sokka flaunting around his arrogance and ignorance. So yeah, we see the gang taking a break and doing things that aren't directly plot related. But that is the plot. Suki puts Sokka in his place. And this is a huge turning point for Sokka's character. He now puts up with this embarrassment, allowing him to learn better ways of fighting as well as progress as a character. So this can't be filler because it's important to his character arc throughout the story and therefore very relevant to the plot. And Aang is using this as an escape so he can feel like a kid and escape from his duties. We even have Katara being slightly immature, showing that, again, despite her being more mature than Aang, she is still a kid. And even though she's technically the mother of the group, she doesn't have all the answers for Aang and she gets fed up and they fight. But she realized long before Aang what her mistake was and went to go make sure that he was okay. And thank God she did, because he was decidedly not okay. So it's at this point he realizes his mistake with Katara, but he still doesn't realize his mistake with avoiding his destiny as the Avatar. It took the Fire Nation attack to do that. He realizes the danger that he brings with him no matter where he goes. And he understands it's not just his job to not stay too long and not endanger people, it is his job to take action to help people. So this can't be filler either, because this is Aang's turning point where he realizes that he has to take action. He may just be a kid, but right now, what the world needs is the Avatar. And that's why I find it so silly that one of the arguments people have when talking about whether this is filler or not is that, well, Suki comes back later, so that's why it's not filler. Like, no, it still could be filler even with Suki coming back later. This episode's focus was on character development, and character development is not filler. Just a couple of things before we move on to the next episode. I just love the fact that even after Sokka humbles himself to learn from Suki, that we get to see that the characters we're following are still just kids. Suki gets so defensive here, and Sokka is so proud of himself. I love this scene. Actually, there are a bunch of hilarious scenes in this episode.
I'm not scared of any girls. Who do they think they are anyway? This is tasty.
I just love how he begrudgingly says, "This is tasty." And I know we all love the cabbage merchant and we bring it up all the time, and he deserves it. But can we please show some respect to our boy Foamy Mouth Guy? Side question, do you think this is just something the Unagi can do, biologically, or do you think it's waterbending? Also, there's that breakdance move again. I do genuinely love the idea that Zuko is using the philosophies and styles of other bending in that final Agni Kai, but this one in particular always bothers me when people say it's airbending. And I know some of you mentioned the last time I talked about this that, well, he fought the Avatar, so he might be implementing that into his style now. And that is one way of interpreting it, but Zuko's not really at the point where he's incorporating other bending styles into his own. And again, this is more of a nod to Dante Bosco being a breakdancer than it is to airbending. But don't let my serious tone distract you from how absolutely hilarious this episode was. That's right, we're at Omashu now. And you know what? Katara has still not said a single thing about hope. Seriously, that is such a meme, and we're 5 episodes in, the only person to mention it so far is quite literally Gran Gran. But I digress, let's get to Omashu because I love this episode. It is next to impossible for me to actually pick a single favorite episode, but this one is definitely up there. I love this episode. Before we get too deep into the episode, let's talk about Ponzu Pippin Padnopsicopoulos III. I've said before, but there is a lot of cartoon logic in Avatar, and it's not just one-off jokes, it is entire plot points. They cannot get into Omashu secretly without Aang having some kind of disguise. So what do? They get some of Appa's fur and just kind of tie it around his head. And that is enough to convince this fine gentleman here. But before we come to their altercation, let's address the elephant, or rather the cabbage, in the room. That's right, it's the first canonical appearance of everyone's favorite merchant of cabbage. And I mentioned in my last video that so much love goes to the cabbage merchant, but not as much love as I think he deserves goes to Foamy Mouth Guy. But not only are people overlooking Foamy Mouth Guy for cabbage merchant, people just don't realize. This man is a snitch. In this very episode, he demands that our main protagonists are beheaded for simply accidentally running into his cabbage cart. Like, sure, you want to punish crime, but that's a little extreme for a couple heads of cabbage. And not just that, he snitches every chance he gets. He snitches to the enemy, the Fire Nation. Supposedly humble merchant of cabbage in the Earth Kingdom snitches to the Fire Nation to such a degree that almost every single detail of their adventures is documented by this man. Now, I wouldn't go as far to say as he's a spy, like he's actually a Fire Nation guy hiding out in the Earth Kingdom, but we also don't know where his hometown is, so I'm not saying that. And then we come to this poor chap. Now, this is a story all about how his life got flip-turned upside down. And I'd like to take a minute. It may not appear it, but this man thinks he just saw a spirit. So, of course, we kind of briefly covered, but this disguise absolutely works for some reason. So, of course, he lets them in, and there's that tense moment of, oh God, does he know? And then he's just like, carry your grandfather's bag, sir. And then his life is changed forever. So, obviously, the disguise works, so he thinks this is hair, and therefore, he must think these are ears. Like, we know this is Momo, but he doesn't. We shouldn't try to impose our knowledge as the audience on him. This man thinks Aang has ears. Now, it's always possible that he's heard a story of humanoid beings with animal-like ears. So what are these humanoid creatures with animal ears? Well, that sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? We got our answer in The Legend of Korra. Many spirits have humanoid shapes, but animal faces and ears. And over the millennia of having little to no access to the spirit world, these stories would shift and change naturally over time as the oral tradition gets adjusted and modified, exaggerated, etc. So this man must think he just saw a walking, talking, corporeal spirit. And he's on guard duty outside. Who knows if he ever made the connection between Ponzu Pippinpadnopsicopolis III and the Avatar. Alright, let's talk about Bumi. In the previous episode, Aang has kind of a kick in the pants that he really needs to get his Avatar button gear. But with no other reason stated, I'm assuming they're going to Amashu so he can kind of relive some fun. Aang still needs some direction here, and that couldn't be more obvious with that mischievous look he has. All he's thinking about when he's remembering Bumi and Omashu is kind of this fun little trick that his friend taught him. And yes, the main point of this series is to try and figure out a grand unified theory of bending, so we will come back to this. But Aang remembers Bumi as a, quote, mad genius because he invented new fun ways to do things. And Bumi even says outright to Aang,
instead of seeing what they want you to see, you gotta open your brain to the possibilities.
Bumi isn't just the kid who has crazy ideas, he has a whole different mindset. Aang never really understood the importance of what Bumi was saying. And of course, he's 12, and this for him was not that long ago. So all he's thinking of are the crazy antics that he can get up to. In the last episode, he got the kick in the pants he really needed to be the avatar for the world, but in this episode is where he starts to realize how he can start doing that. Or at the very least, the mindset he needs. Because as much fun as terrifying Sokka and Katara is, he still needs to learn a lesson, doesn't he? But we'll get to that in the next episode because I really want to talk about this technology. So if you've ever watched anything like How It's Made, or you've worked in a warehouse, then you'll recognize this type of conveyor belt. It's not like the ones in the grocery stores, but it is something that is used in modern technology. So this is really our first hint about the kind of technology the Earth Kingdom uses. And to make it work, it entirely relies on earthbending. The Fire Nation had pressures to improve and increase their technologies, and we'll get to that when we talk about the Mechanist, but the Earth Kingdom is a little different. So obviously the Earth Kingdom does have use for some kind of technology, case in point. But thanks to bending, they can actually skip a number of steps that in the real world we would have to overcome. Someone like Sokka or the Mechanist could easily come up with some kind of idea that would do a similar job to these earthbenders, moving the crates and getting them on and off the conveyor belt and changing their direction and things like that. But in the beginning stages, it would probably be slower because there's a lot of other moving parts, bits and pieces that would make it inefficient that you have to overcome over time. But it would take a lot of research and a lot of testing to get to the level of these earthbenders, but you already have the earthbenders, so why would you bother making it more complicated? This is why it does kind of make sense that a place like Republic City, where there's a very big mix of different kinds of benders and non-benders, that they would start to create more and more technology that doesn't require very specific kinds of bending to run. But as far as the Earth Kingdom goes, as long as there are any earthbenders, you can just keep this working because that's only half the job. Gravity does the rest. It's an ingenious piece of technology, but it doesn't really require any improvements until you increase your non-earthbending population or your demand for the service. But they obviously did have some kind of demand to decrease friction, so somebody came up with this idea that is, again, seen in a lot of modern technology. So it's really interesting to see the combination of something purely driven by bending plus technological innovations only insofar as they help the bending along. But maybe they should install some cages, or maybe station a person or two at every egress and ingress to the system so this doesn't happen. Also, this scene just kills me. But I do want to point out why I'm still saying there's a lot of cartoon logic in this show that we kind of have to sift through if we want to figure out this grand unified theory of bending. Because in what I'm about to show you, there is no earthbending going on. Big explosion. That part at the end, they were just moving sideways. So first there's this explosion of dust, which obviously exaggerated, but there is dust and dirt. This is an Earth Kingdom city, so that kind of makes sense. But the sound effect also makes it sound like, why did the crate not break? But then once they hit a floor again, they just keep sliding as if there's no friction. That's what I mean by cartoon logic. This one is definitely just more of a gag than anything else, but this is very common in the show, and so we have to be careful if we're going to go super theorist brain on this, right? Because obviously none of them were earthbending, unless there might have been an earthbender among them. Never underestimate Lord Momo of the Momo dynasty. Okay, now let's talk about Old Man Boomy. So obviously both we and our main characters don't know that this is in fact Boomy until later. And it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure it out, but I did figure it out before the gang, so there's that. In my defense, as a 12-year-old kid, I didn't quite get it at first. Because, I mean, look, there's that very distinct tooth missing when he's younger, and most of the shots are pretty far away. However, I should have noticed it when they did a close-up like this, but it took me a little longer. But it's only now that I also realize everything he did was planned. Like, we are talking Dark Knight Joker levels of not actually a crazy person, but actually really good at planning here. Now, in the newly refurbished jail that was once bad, we see Momo sitting here lazing around, not wanting to try and escape. I'm probably thinking way too much into this, but I really feel like Momo is the representation of, like, the archetypical airbender mentality. Like, sure, it's a funny gag that he's too fat from eating the apple and he's lazing around and he doesn't want to try and help escape. But what if he's there showing you don't need to worry about escaping, just live in the moment? Now, again, this is probably just because it looks nice or it's a clean animation or whatever, but there are exactly 3 beds. There is definitely room for more than 3 beds here, right? So do we just mark it off as just an aesthetic choice because it looks cool for the shot? Or do we try to go full theorist brain on it and say Boomy planned this? Because believe it or not, he planned out a lot. I mean, look at this. Sure, it's funny, he's being goofy, and he kind of tricked out Aang like, oh, that's not the real test. You know, just tell me how I look. Do you like my robe? He is carefully crafting an image for himself. He's not going to be sitting down anymore, he's going to be walking and moving. So to hide that beautiful physique he has to wear something baggy and bulky and something that will cover him up, and also something that is flamboyant. It just plays into the idea that he's just some crackpot old man. And with the Genomite, am I thinking too much about this? When the Genomite grows, it glows. So I think now's a really good time to talk about this grand unified theory of bending. Because this is not how crystal normally grows, and the glowing indicates that it is in some sense magical. So here's a refresher of the theory that I'm trying to find evidence for or against. So we know that the benders are bending through their chi, right? And we're not going to bother with the genetic chi aspect of this just yet. So in my theory, it's not just the user's chi, but the elements themselves have some kind of spiritual aspect or spiritual energy to them. And this Genomite might be an exception, but it seems like that's kind of what's happening here. It is naturally bending, for lack of a better term. The crystal has some kind of inherent energy to it, and it is creeping and covering them with this slow release of energy. The question is it just this Genomite, or do all elements, so all earth, all rock, all water, all fire, have this kind of spiritual energy in it that is what's actually being bent? And so effectively what you're bending is not the physical element per se, that's just the result. What you're bending is your energy interacting with this other energy. With bloodbending, for example, you're trying to bend that energy while also not being able to bend the much more prevalent human chi in the person. I feel like there was an easier way of describing that, but my brain is just blanking. And same with metal bending. The more you work something with your hands, the less of that natural energy there is. It's maybe, released out into the world, right? So those impurities are not necessarily little bits and pieces of earth, but bits and pieces of that spiritual earth energy still remaining. But who knows? We'll talk about the actual tests in the next video. Finally, Boomy's deadly challenges. As will be told in a later episode, air is the element of freedom, which of course means freedom of thought, freedom of being, things like that. But for being a very talented airbender who is fun-loving and freedom-loving, Aang is very stubborn in his ways. So as we go through these tests, we'll start to see that Bumi has a much more airbender-like mentality than Aang does, at least in my opinion. So the first test is to get a key from the waterfall. So I've got two things to talk about, what the lesson is of this test, and a little bit about airbending. So first, the airbending. How exactly is a lot of this airbending working? Aang has used it for super speed, and here he's using it to, slice through the air as he dives faster and faster. But, other than the vague idea of air helps him do that, how? Now, I've noticed a lot of you are very good at trying to figure out some scientific explanations, so please leave that in the comments. I'd love to see them. But at the end of the day, scientific explanation or not, this is definitely not something that I think he's consciously doing. By treating his element, air, as an extension of his body, he's just kind of naturally using it to enhance his abilities. But in a way that I'm not really sure if it holds up scientifically or if, again, we're just on cartoon logic. And right here, he's not even using airbender motions, he's just got a bubble around him. In some of my Korra videos, I did talk a little bit about how the martial arts are intrinsic to how bending works, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. There's just instances where your motions don't matter as much as your intention, your focus. So we're going to see how this develops throughout the rest of the series, but I have two thoughts about what this means. Thought number one, I'm just wrong, and the martial arts have much less to do with bending than I was giving it credit for. Option number two, we know that there were retcons and rewrites and things that changed over time even in the original series. So this could be one of those things where this is just a book one kind of thing, and largely, usually, unless you have some kind of special talent or connection, you have to use the martial arts to guide the bending. Or at least to do complicated stuff like this. But it'll take at least until book 2 to figure that out. So what's the lesson here? I would say the lesson is about being aware of your surroundings and using philosophies that are maybe not as familiar to you. And I don't just mean Bumi's catchphrase of think of the possibilities. Aang literally has to earthbend without earthbending to get the job done. He has to think like an earthbender. Like an avatar. So what about test number 2? No, Flopsy's design was definitely never reused for Voltron. So the second test is to catch Flopsy, who Aang initially believes is this cute little fella. But it's actually this handsome fella. So what's the lesson here? The generic things are not always as they seem, but also we get a very interesting parallel. The frail, harmless Bumi is just the same as the frail, harmless bunny rabbit. But much like actual Bumi, as we'll see later, Flopsy is far different than initially thought. This lesson is almost directly telling Aang that later on when he chooses an opponent, don't go with the weak, frail-looking one. Because in this final test, it combines the previous two. Even though Aang is only an airbender, he has to think like an earthbender, like an avatar. And of course the obvious setup that Aang should have seen coming. The thing is though, Bumi keeps taunting, showing that he is old enough to have met airbenders. And Bumi is showing a freedom of thought and a freedom of movement that you would associate with an airbender, even though he's an earthbender, while Aang can hardly fathom how to think like an earthbender. But once he realizes what he needs to do, he finally begins to learn his lesson. And what's the final test? Figuring out who this guy is.
I got it. Yeah? He's an earthbender, right? Rocky. You know, because of all the rocks.
We're gonna keep trying, but that is a good backup.
Did I mention this was one of my favorite episodes? And of course, the last lesson that we need to remember, the most important lesson, I think, is this one.
And it looks like you're in good hands. You'll need your friends to help you defeat the Fire Nation. And you'll need Momo, too.
And just when you thought I wasn't going to reference Lord Momo of the Momo Dynasty yet again, I did. I have a confession to make. Okay, so I'm not exactly saying something a lot of you didn't already know, but in case you're new, I haven't actually read the comics. So this is probably going to be one of the last Korra-related videos that I make for a while because I really need to rewatch that, and I clearly need to read the comics before I talk any more about The Legend of Korra. I am pretty confident in most of what I've said so far, but I am coming up on the limit of what I can confidently remember, and it's been a while. That being said, I did try to read the comics when they were first coming out, and it's been so long, I really can't remember why I didn't finish them. I can't remember if I didn't like them or if I just forgot. So back to the comments that I'm replying to. I understand that a lot of what people are saying they read in the comics, and I guess I think there's also novels, what people are telling me it will make a lot more sense when I read them. I'm going to have a lot more context to go off of, so that goes without saying. But no amount of context could prepare me for Sokka on a forklift. So I have both criticized and defended at different points the technology in The Legend of Korra. Because I don't really have a problem with the technology in Korra from just it existing kind of basis. It's more about the writing and what the consequences were. But I really don't know how much context can give me an answer of Sokka at this age, so it's clearly not super late in the game. So at this recently past the finale of Avatar The Last Airbender, we have a fully functioning forklift. Because, I mean, obviously Sokka's probably going to play a huge role in the invention of the internal combustion engine. I really feel like that is just self-evident, right? But this is not like... See, I don't know how this is running, okay? Like, this is not a prototype-looking device. It's not a cobbled-together-looking device. This is a fully functioning forklift. Panels and all. I don't know if, like, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of bending involved, so it either has to be an internal combustion engine or a battery-operated electric motor. And in both cases, this seems way too early for that, and I don't know, it rubs me the wrong way. And especially, like, the level of technology we see in The Legend of Korra tells me that this should not exist in the decade that it clearly does, unless they're older than they appear to be. I mean, look at... you could argue they're adults, maybe? I don't know, they still kind of look like teenagers to me, but maybe they're full-grown adults, but I don't think it's been a full decade since Avatar Last Airbender ended. Could it? I don't know, man. So... throw me for a loop, dude. I know I've been MIA for a few days. We will absolutely be getting back to the normal Avatar rewatch in the next video. But God, I hope I can get some answers for this thing, man. And now another one of my favorite episodes for all the Takei reasons. Actually, we'll talk about the first half of the episode first, and then we'll get to George Takei. I do genuinely love the kind of tongue-in-cheek subplot that Momo is learning earthbending through this episode. I just love how in this scene, Momo, like, genuinely thinks it's him making those big rumbles. But of course, it's not Momo. It's someone new and mysterious, and Sokka, very understandably, is cautious. But Katara's not. Now, we haven't had a single hit on the Katara Hope-o-meter quite yet. She hasn't even said the word hope so far in these episodes, but this is an honorable mention, where she is literally acting out her hopeful nature. I also just want to point out, they're not in disguise right now, I mean, except Aang with the hat, but other than that, they're just wearing their normal clothes. And we have yet to see anyone else wearing at least waterbender-style clothing at all. And sure, no one has seen an airbender in years, so maybe they just don't know how they dress, but you would think that these people would stand out a little more than they do. I mean, even when they find Haru, find some random guy they've never seen before. Not even a Fire Nation soldier recognizes them. He gets a good... Sorry, hang on. No, he gets a good look at these guys and doesn't see anything out of the ordinary. He makes some vague threats about the taxes going up and kind of, the fire could go out of control. But he makes no mention of the Water Tribe kids or this strangely dressed kid. It's just normal to him, despite the fact that there are very culturally based color codes going on. Like, they're more terrified of Haru being found out for being an earthbender than associating with foreigners. It's probably just an artistic choice because they don't need to show other people from other villages and other areas and other clothing, but, I don't know, it just seems a little odd to me. I mean, they're even comfortable enough that they give him a place to stay, which allows this beautiful scene.
But you should leave in the morning.
Thanks. I'll make sure Appa doesn't eat all your hay.
Hey, what, you guys talking about me? Yeah, whatever. Appa is nonplussed. There are 0 pluses for this beefy boy. That didn't make sense. I don't know, I'm going with it. Also, just really quick, I cannot get over how gorgeous these sunsets are in the show. And we'll see in just a minute, they are so good at building atmosphere. You hear this a lot in film and television discussion, but there's this idea that you want to show, not tell. And there is a lot of telling, because it is technically a kid's show, but what they show adds so much impact to the things they say. So then, we get to this guy. Cabbage merchant slander aside, this man is the first true Earth Nation snitch we have ever seen. This man repays being saved by Haru, who himself almost didn't save him for fear of retribution, goes and tells the Fire Nation that there's an earthbender. How's that for gratitude? When I'm talking about showing and telling, this scene is what really comes to mind. So Haru was just taken in the last scene, and we immediately cut to this normal day-to-day life looking scene, serene music, no talking going on, and then she looks. With no words spoken, and in the very next scene, the very first words spoken are, they took Haru, but with no words spoken, and things we already knew, they communicated so much emotion by showing and not telling. So credit to the writers, the storyboard artists, and the animators to not only keeping it understandable and explained enough for kids to follow along, but for also allowing such cinematic beauty and intense emotion like this scene. I mean, she turns around, doesn't say a word, and tears just start rolling. We as the audience already know what happened, but assume they didn't have a scene where Haru was taken, this would still work because of how well it was done. All we needed was a scene of this guy talking to these guys, and didn't even have to be at their house. This look alone would have told us exactly what happened. Aang has had 2 rude awakening moments in the show so far. He's realized that he really does have a duty to the rest of the world, and nowhere is safe if he stays too long. He's learned he needs to think outside of the box and really start thinking like an avatar. But there's one critical piece missing still in episode 6. He has no sense of urgency. Keep in mind, Haru has just been kidnapped, and Aang is very nonchalant. Even in this small story, Aang does not really have a sense of urgency. Part of the theme is that his childlike nature is very important to who he is, and there is a reason why it has stuck so strong even after those rude awakenings. So he knows how important this is, he knows that he needs to think differently, but there's still that lack of urgency. And that's something he really won't get until he learns about the comet, but that of course comes later. In the meantime, while we're having fun, let's talk about one of my favorite scenes.
Get out of my way, Pipsqueak!
How dare
I
you
just
call
love
me
how
Pipsqueak,
badly they're
you
acting in this scene.
giant-eared cretin?
What did you call me?
A giant-eared cretin. Look at those things. Do herds of animals use them for shade?
You better back off. Seriously, back off.
The acting in the scene is so terrible, but I love that it does still kind of get a little personal for Sokka. But also just, how oblivious are these Fire Nation guys? They didn't notice anything was weird here. They didn't really realize anything was off here, despite the obviously terrible acting. Let's take a look at the rest of that scene to see how absolutely oblivious these guys are. Like, no wonder Aang has no sense of urgency with these guys.
Large your ears are.
That's it. You're going down.
I'll show you who's boss. Earthbending style. I said earthbending style.
Here it comes, our Lord and Savior. Could it be? It's...
Lemur, he's earthbending.
This guy gets it. That's right, we finally get Lord Momo of the Momo Dynasty in his second instance of earthbending in the episode. But also, their first reaction is, it must be the lemur. I can see why they don't really see a threat in these guys. So we finally get to see where they took Haru, and what George Takei has to do with any of this. I guess we'll find out next time. Katara's been captured, and now we finally get to see where Haru went. And once again, the only disguise you need to fool the Fire Nation is hats, apparently. And now we're about to see how truly star-studded this episode actually is. Because now we have evil George Takei. But also with the Fire Nation, I have noticed that there is a theme of arrogance. It's that same kind of false confidence that Zuko suffers from that is exemplified by almost every single leader of Fire Nation troops. Like, he makes this big speech like, don't think of me as your prison warden, think of me as your honorable host, and you my dear friends. Only for one guy to just cough, and he just explodes in anger. Now, if it was just this instance, you could argue this is just to make them more pliable to his demands, to weaken their resolve, but it's not the only instance. He exudes a kind of powerful, calm confidence, which is definitely helped by George Takei's voice, but underneath it all is insecurities. And finally, Katara reunites with Haru, and we get introduced to another absolute legend in voice acting.
The prisoners are complaining there aren't enough blankets to go around.
I'll talk to the guards. In the meantime, make sure the elderly...
And that, my friends, is the great Kevin Michael Richardson. They went all out for the powerful, commanding voices, and I wonder if it was intentional that his voice was just as calming, confident, and powerful to juxtapose to the Warden. But finally, we get Katara's big speech. Will we finally get a hit on our Katara Hopometer?
Every child in my Water Tribe village was rocked to sleep with stories of the brave Earth Kingdom and the courageous Earthbenders who guard its borders. Some of you may think that the Fire Nation has made you powerless. Yes, they have taken away your ability
Hope?
to bend.
Oh, no.
But they can't take away your
Hope?
courage.
Oh,
And it is your courage
courage.
they should truly fear, because it runs deeper than any mine you've been forced to dig.
So, not hope, courage. Maybe it'll come in the second speech. Let's find out. I also love how he clearly understands that not only is this speech not going to rouse them, but just by rejecting it, it draws them closer to that hopeless stage that they're in right now. Katara has not had a single hit on the Hopometer, but her personality is so endlessly hopeful. And of course, when it's time for them to leave, Katara doesn't want to go. She knows where Haru is, she knows her time limit, and she still says, we need to help everyone. It's Katara's motherly instinct to help everyone, and that is something that really helps Aang realize over time that he really needs to help everyone just like she does. That's why the gang is so amazingly well built. like all of the properties you should have in your main protagonist are distributed through everyone, and they all kind of influence each other in that way and grow and get better and collectively become the main protagonist of the series. But now let's get to that second outburst I alluded to.
Which was it, a buffalo or a bison?
I'm not sure what the difference is, but that's not really the point, is it, sir?
I'll decide what the point is, fool.
Hi. A truly genuinely confident person would not need to have such a rash and violent outburst like this. And of course, this is partially to show the cruelty of the Fire Nation as a whole, and especially its leaders, but more importantly, this is a toxic, arrogant type of false confidence. This is the kind of false confidence that Zuko has fallen victim to. He is following the example of all of the other leaders other than Iroh. So even in an episode without Zuko at all, we're actually getting more insight into Zuko himself and how he got to the way that he is now. And of course, we cut forward to the Great Escape, and they're caught pretty much immediately. The Warden thinks there's no hope at all. Firepower for the Earthbenders! And who do we have to thank for this blessing of coal? They might have you thinking that it's Aang. No, my friends, it was Lord Momo of the Momo dynasty, you see. His Momoness. He's an Earthbender now. Didn't you know that? Sound off in the chat if you stand for Momo. The Earthbenders have coal now, so... now what? This is Katara's second speech. Do we finally get her talking about hope? No. But instead...
Foolish girl. You thought a few inspirational words and some coal would change these people? Look at these blank, hopeless faces.
Sure, what he actually said was hopeless, but he's the only one to mention hope here. Not Katara. And he's right. He has a stranglehold over their mentality, over their wills. But just when it seems that all hope is lost, get wrecked. Actually, can we talk about this for just a second? So I know that technically coal is considered a rock, right? But like that's really a technicality because it's a sedimentary rock because it is the buildup of sediment, but it's not the same kind of sedimentary rock like sandstone or limestone or something like that, right? Like it's not minerals or sand or dirt that is accumulating, although a little bit of that is accumulating. It's dead plant and animal matter, mostly plant matter. This is why it can be so tricky to take a fully real world science approach to what is bending, what is considered earth, and all the controversy around my metal bending video. Because the question then becomes, at what point does it stop being plant matter and start being earth? My running theory so far as to what counts as each element is kind of a spiritual component. Because we'll see in a second that there's a lot of interesting powers that earthbenders have. So you have a bunch of plants, they become peat moss. That peat moss begins to decay further and weigh down and get buried with more peat moss, etc., etc. It gets buried with dirt, whatever, and it starts getting more and more pressurized, so the peat moss gets pressed into coal. That's a very basic version of how coal happens. So it's not earth when it's the plants, right? Is it earth when it's peat moss? Because there's going to be a point where it's not quite coal, but we may not necessarily call it peat moss because it's been hardened. Like, at what point does it become coal? At what point does it become earth? Because that's a very gradual process. Or do we not have to worry about that at all? Because if it is about each element having its own kind of natural chi, natural spirit, spiritual energy to it, then that answers that question right then and there. Plants are living things and therefore have their own unique kind of plant chi, let's say. There's water running through them, so there's some degree of water energy. And depending on how much water there is in there, you can either manipulate the plant itself or at the very least strip the water out of it. But at some point it becomes peat moss, it loses a lot of its water, and over time, as it becomes more one with the earth, for lack of a better term, it begins to be infused with that earth energy. Now, this is just about coal, and it's really dependent on how you view that as whether or not it's a rock and everything like that, but so far that's at least a little evidence for my current running Grand Unified Theory of Bending. Back to the show. Let's just take a moment to appreciate how ridiculously strong earthbending is and also just looks when they're bending it. I love this tandem wave of coal. Every move has just such power. And also, earthbenders can crumble rock with earthbending, and they can also fuse a bunch of rock together, actually fuse it. So, who's to say if you don't squeeze more, that becomes lava? Yeah, if you haven't seen it, people are still not very happy on my take with lava bending, which, to be fair, is not even originally my take. And one last point about bending in the show and why it's so difficult to figure things out. They can clearly see this just as well as the audience can. But when you try to do this in live action, the air is mostly invisible, so it would be kind of difficult to find the opening to put in the coal. So once again, we run into a bit of cartoon logic. And once again, the day is saved thanks to the Powerpuff Girls. Wait, wrong show. But truly, the day is saved and everyone is free and ready to go. And Katara notices her necklace is missing. Yeah, I was a little surprised that not only did they let her keep her normal clothes under the prison garb, but also let her keep her jewelry for some reason. Regardless, that is long gone, and despite the fact that last time I said Zuko is not in this episode, tune in next time to see if Katara will ever talk about hope. Episode 7, The Spirit World. Science in Avatar is not a one-for-one to the real world, and we've seen a few pieces of evidence for that, but here's some evidence for it being quite similar to the real world. Aang decides to find out if clouds are fluffy, and it turns out they're just made of water. Something that will come in very handy when they're stuck in the desert in Book 2. But right as they're goofing off and having a great time, they come across the scar in the land caused by the Fire Nation. Yet more evidence that Aang really needs to do something. And at this point, he knows he needs to do something, and he wants to do something, but he's lacking that sense of urgency. No matter how much he wants to help, he really does not feel ready. And if he's not ready, he's going to take his time. I mean, it's been 100 years, what's a couple more? He needs to do something, but he still doesn't know that he needs to do it by the end of next summer. Without that sense of urgency, he doesn't have as much of a drive to get where he's going faster than he is. Meanwhile, Zuko comes across an interesting scene. But to be fair, he does need a bath, apparently. Also, when Katara is trying to cheer Aang up, she didn't have to throw an acorn, but I am kind of glad that she did. Do I want to use this opportunity to talk about how the acorn is a state break and why state breaks are important? Really? Oh, he says I shouldn't. Also, can we just talk about the fact that he sees their strange clothing and then sees the tattoos and is like, you must be the Avatar. Like, the Fire Nation soldiers really were just that oblivious. Like, did you not ask about why they're dressed differently from everyone else? But random Joe Schmo over here is like, looks like an Avatar to me. Well, consider this. Iroh is attacked by very obvious, jagged rocks coming up out of the ground, and he is captured. And then the Fire Nation soldiers take one look at this and go, well, that looks like a landslide. Yeah, they really are that dumb. So Aang agrees to help with the spirit monster issue. I just want to take another moment to talk about how amazing these sunset shots are. They're just... But I'm also curious how they know the name of the spirit. They know it's called the Heibai, but they don't yet know that it's the spirit of the forest, so I just wonder where that name came from. Aang does his little spiel, hopes it does the trick, and it doesn't. First of all, the design of Heibai is amazing. But if this is what the villagers are seeing, how do they know it's Heibai? Under normal circumstances, Heibai just looks like a panda, so how do they know that this is Heibai? Or is that just the name they gave to him because of old stories they'd heard, but they had never seen any renditions of Heibai? Like, have they never seen the bear statue here? I mean, it's possible. It is in the middle of what would have been the woods. Now, Heibai being just a regular panda does bring up another point that I think is really interesting about the show. For those who don't know, Avatar was originally going to be set in a dystopian future where Momo was a robot, and I think it was like Momo 2 or something like that, and Aang's staff was kind of part mystical, part technological. And that brings up an interesting question about spirits like Heibai. Are we living in a post-apocalyptic world? Like, the characters know what regular animals look like, or what they are technically, but they don't exist. Like, when the Earth King's bear comes up, they're like, surely you mean skunk bear, or duck bear, or something. No, just bear? That's weird. Like, even the names of the creatures imply that there were normal animals before this. I don't have that idea fully fleshed out yet. I haven't really gone online to see what other people think about it, but it's just something that comes up in my mind every now and again. Like, is it still technically post-apocalypse? And now that we know about harmonic convergence and the human and spirit planes once being one, as retconned in Korra, like, was that part of the apocalypse? Did the meshing of these two cause some kind of massive shift that led to the collapse of the old civilization? I don't know. Questions for later. Because Aang's got some problems of his own. Aang never noticed when he transitioned into the spirit world. There was no big shock. There was no portal he felt like he went through. He's just in the spirit world now. And this was retconned pretty quickly, but the spirit world is quite literally just a plane of existence on the regular world. Aang realizes he can't airbend here, but in the proper spirit world, you can bend the elements. Because the spirit world proper is just an actual world with its own flora, its own fauna, its own creatures, its own people. So I don't know if this version of the spirit world is ever, like, truly explained, because it's technically astral projection going by the logic of Korra, but he is also in the spirit world because we see Fang. So is Fang astral projecting himself from the spirit world to the spiritual plane in the living world? Is this not truly the spirit world? By the end of book 1, this is already retconned. I mean, we see when Aang goes to the spirit world to look for the ocean and moon spirits that it has its own foliage, its own areas. It is a different place entirely to the regular world. So is he actually in the spirit world as is stated in this episode, or is it now fully retconned to where this isn't actually the spirit world, he is just astral projecting? Let's also take a moment to appreciate one of my favorite character types, the bumbling idiot who is actually a genius. Like, we already know that Iroh is an amazing, talented master of the arts, right? He's a great philosopher, he's a clever tactician, and he is a master firebender. But one of my absolute favorite tropes is when characters like that act dumb to get things done because that is the most efficient way to get it done, and people constantly underestimate them. And I've briefly covered this before, but I'm just going to briefly mention it again. Steam. On my journey to figure out what exactly people are actually bending in the Avatar universe, this grand unified theory of bending, we have to know one thing in particular when it comes to steam. Are they creating small fires like within their nostrils to heat up the air, or are they literally bending heat itself? Scenes like when Sozin is taking either smoke or like visualized heat out of the lava in a flashback scene, that seems to indicate that they are possibly bending heat. But if it's smoke, then smoke is technically still fire. It's just gaseous fire and not plasmoid fire, right? But if it is truly just heat bending, could not a master firebender do this without the breath, the steam? Just like manipulate the heat of the object itself or something like that? And maybe there's a scene I'm forgetting where they do exactly that. I really don't know. But in either case, I do absolutely love the fact that Zuko sees the Avatar, thinks for a moment, but then truly prioritizes his family. If you didn't have any sympathy for Zuko so far, you have sympathy now because he is starting to get his priorities straight, despite his obsessive nature over the Avatar. Last video about part 1 of this 2-parter episode. Can we talk about how strong these guys are? Zuko breaks Iroh's chains with nothing but a kick. Is the type of metal just too brittle, in which case Iroh could have broken out at any time, or is Zuko just that strong? Also, let's just appreciate the absolute flex of saying, we may be outnumbered, but you are clearly outmatched. And they were. Iroh doesn't bend once in this entire scene, he just uses the chains. Zuko's doing a great job and doing his best, but he is being clearly outshined by Iroh. This just shows how great of a martial artist that Iroh truly is, because if he doesn't even need to bend, by God, what can he do when he does? Another thing I find very interesting is that Aang doesn't learn anything about Heibai. He kind of figures it out on his own. His experience in the spirit world kind of gave him a sort of insight into the spirit world. All he learned is a way to talk to Roku. He figured this out all on his own. He now knows the feeling of being a spirit without being told exactly what to do, and I think that's a really nice touch. And again, we find out that Heibai's true form is just a regular panda, which I still think is interesting. And now they have a real sense of urgency. They need to see the summer solstice tomorrow. So in part 2, we're going to see Aang figure out that not only is there a time limit for this, there is a time limit for him beating the Fire Lord. Last question before that, though. Is this the exact same shoe he used to track Iroh in Book 3? Like, did he just never give it back to Iroh, or did he pick up one of his shoes again at a later time? Because if you've ever left any dirty clothes in a bag with other stuff, all of that other stuff starts to smell like the dirty laundry. So, like, if he kept it, where was it, and did his stuff smell? So now Aang has less than a day to get to the Fire Temple. What's he gonna do? Go by himself, of course. Aang finally got that very last kick in the pants he needs to really get the ball rolling with this Avatar stuff. He is freaked, he doesn't know what's gonna happen, and so he does not want to endanger anyone else. He's not even bringing Momo. But is that gonna stop our heroes? Absolutely not. And once again, Momo acting as the visual representation of where Aang should be, as opposed to where Aang is. Again, I'm probably reading way too much into Momo, but he really is fulfilling the role of visually showing when Aang is on the right path or not. But right after they leave, it does not take very long for Zuko and friends to show up. And I didn't even notice until I started recording this, he still doesn't have any clothes on. The chase is on, and the sun is already rising. The clock is ticking. Just imagine the absolute cliffhanger at the end of the last episode, knowing that that was part 1 of 2, and this comes out and there's already a ticking clock. Boy, I was glued to the edge of my seat. And of course, Zuko was hot on his trail, but they're leading him right to the Fire Nation, and remember, Zuko is banished.
What if you're caught? I'm chasing the Avatar. My father will understand why I'm returning home.
You give him too much credit.
While I'm sure Zuko knows deep down that that's not true, he really tries to convince himself that if I just do this one thing, Father will understand, and nope, he won't, I promise. So now we've got 2 points of tension, either Zuko or the Fire Nation catching up to these guys, or Zuko himself being caught by the Fire Nation. And if you just saw him as insert villain number 1 over here before, we've started to see more of his humanity in the last few episodes, so he's sympathetic too. You don't want him to get caught either. I mean, especially not by Zhao. Also, it is just such an Iroh thing to be like, I understand we have to light this tar on fire and shoot down the Avatar and what have you, but can't we just add like some lavender or something? I don't have a note for this screenshot, I just love the faces that they animate for these characters sometimes. And of course, it is in fact Zhao he's standing up against, who is somehow always at just the right place. Zuko's been hit, and these catapults are starting to act a little funny. Again, I know it's cartoon logic, but I just gotta talk about it. How are they aiming these things to go so unbelievably high, like through the clouds themselves, like this high through the clouds, but then later fire almost directly straight forward? Like, how are you aiming that? But also, can we talk about this for a second? Aang can only airbend, so he is pulverizing a rock and dissipating all of the fire with a single kick. That's amazing. Also, to try and get a screenshot for this part of the scene, I captured what I think is only 1 frame, so it was pure luck that I even caught this. This right here is right as Aang kicks that fireball. What a clever way to make it feel impactful and kind of feel like an explosion, right? Because another frame I caught was just the fire going past. I was a little too slow and the fire filled the frame. But then suddenly, just this. This is what I love about animation and why I really wish that we could, I wish that we could do something similar in live action that is incredibly stylistic but only lasts for like 1 or 2 frames. I don't know how to describe it. I just feel like, God, how do I describe that? Let's just chalk it up to animation having so much more leeway than live action with stuff like this, and it's really, really cool about how clever people are with it. The gang finally manages to slip past the blockade, and so does Zuko, and they pretty much immediately knew Zhao just let them pass. Now that they're past that, the gang has a little reprieve before entering the temple, and Momo, I guess, tests the tensile strength of a tree. So far there's no one around though, so they just go in. And this is where things get really interesting. So here's a question for you. Do you think the Fire Sages actually believe in the Fire Nation propaganda, or do you think that they do truly believe in the Avatar, but they are really trying to save their hides, and they don't think that this kid can defend them in any way? Either way, they chase them down until they meet this guy. The one Fire Sage who has not bought into the propaganda and who is willing to help despite the risk that comes to him. And despite being apprehensive at first, they were pretty quick to trusting this guy, all things considered. I also just kind of want to know how some of these contraptions work. Like, what is the firebending doing that opens the door or causes the mechanisms to move, you know? Like with the air temple, it makes sense, but here, I don't know, I'm just curious. Back with Iroh and Zuko, they talk about the fact that, yeah, Zhao is clearly letting them pass so that he can follow them and find the Avatar himself. So Zuko decides, let's give him something to follow. I do love how restrained Iroh is being, despite how he is being animated as clearly very concerned about whether or not this plan is going to work. Because this way, he's leaving all his troops and therefore all his defense behind. And back at the temple, we are finally at the doorway, but it's locked. Roku is so close, but apparently it takes 5 simultaneous fire blasts to get through this door. Up to this point, we have seen some of Sokka's strategic abilities and his intelligence, but his true inventiveness and ingenuity, I think, is first truly realized right here in this scene. Because sure, normally you need 5 firebenders to open this door, or 1 fully realized Avatar. But Sokka has an idea.
Previously on Avatar.
Sokka had an idea. In episode 3, we talked about the blubber jerky and how it's a little weird that it's jerky, and yet still flammable enough to light a fire with, right? Now, Sokka still has blubber and oil, which I know where he got the oil, they just got supplies in the previous episode, but where did they get the blubber? Immaterial, because he learned this from his father. And boy, are improvised explosives just so much fun. To unlock the door, you need firebending. So, let's give it a very powerful, firebending-like blast. See if that works. And as our heroes say, it looks just as powerful as any fire blast, but it doesn't work, does it? So even though Sokka's idea was brilliant, and I love that we're seeing more and more every episode of how smart Sokka really is, Katara is the one who realizes, it's not over just because it didn't work. It looks like it worked. And that's, of course, when our Lord and Savior, Lord Momo of the Momo Dynasty, does the most important part of this next trick. Once again, whether on purpose or just me overanalyzing, he is on the path where Aang needs to be. But in this case, as a distraction. Or put better, a lure. They light it up and see what's inside, which is Momo. And once again, showing his prowess in battle, Momo goes on the attack. But it's too late. Despite their attacks and holding on to the sages, Zuko caught up. Remember, Zuko got here before Zhao because he put up a smokescreen. He had a very smart idea of his own. But Aang was so fast getting away, I couldn't even get him leaping through the door easily. I do love the choreography, though. Check this out. Aang's getaway was smooth. I just love when they show the airbending style without any airbending. Notice how he didn't even airbend until his very last kick. He got out of it without any airbending, just with that Bagua Zhang style that airbending has. I just love those little details. But now the door is sealed, and the light is on the statue. So now, Aang can finally meet Avatar Roku. My Roku needs a little bit of work, but I'll roll with it. Because we learn, you must defeat the Fire Lord before the comet arrives by the end of summer. But outside, we've got a different story. Not only is our one friendly in the Fire Nation captured, Zhao wasn't really tricked by that smokescreen. I don't want to rain on Zuko's parade. It was a smart idea, but Zhao is pretty smart. But once again, we've got that projected false confidence coming out of Zhao. That is about to turn its ugly head, and Zuko is going to notice. Roku finishes telling Aang the bad news, but also tells him that he is there to help. And we don't get the full story, but we finally have our ticking clock, and that is the last element that Aang needed to really get off of his butt and get things going. And boy, does it get going. I noticed recently more people aren't really staying to the end of these videos, so I really, really want to show off how cool this scene is, so we will pick this up in the next video. Whew, chills. Let's talk about the scene that gave me chills. We've had cool scenes, we've had emotional scenes, but for me personally, I never had chills like this until this very scene.
A great danger awaits you at the temple. I can help you face the threat, but only if you are ready.
Here it comes.
Ready?
No! Aang!
Fire! Avatar Roku.
The buildup of just the glow here. I mean, oh, I love this scene. And notice the music is kind of the Avatar theme. Bum, 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 bum. But it's undercut with, and I can't pin down the exact notes, but it feels like maybe it's the instrumentation or the pacing, or maybe there are notes that I'm just not noticing, but it feels like it's undercut with the Fire Nation theme, or at least the feel of it. It's so intense and chilling. And then, of course, I'm going to leave that in. And then, compose yourself. And then the classic anime eyes in the darkness, which is just, every time it's used in Avatar or in anime, or if Avatar is anime, fight in the comments. It is just so effective at building tension and telling you the person you're about to see is about to kick butt. And boy, does he. Between the music and the shots, this scene just, when I was 12 and today, this scene will never not give me chills. And of course, the first official lava bending, I know we saw it before in a little flash with other avatars, but this is the first time it is diegetic within the story, lava bending. And both in that little story flash and here, it's only avatars doing it. And in the Avatar extras, lava bending was fire bending and earth bending combined, so only the Avatar could do it. I understand this was later retconned to be a specialty of earthbenders, right? So everyone who is this far in the video, we're going to leave the whole, which bending styles combined is lava bending, and just stick to this question. Do you like it better when only the Avatar could lava bend, or do you like it better when it's earthbenders? I'm honestly still on the fence about it. When I first saw it in Legend of Korra, I was a little taken aback, but the characters were great, so I just kind of left it at that, but I just didn't feel right with it, but now I'm just kind of on the fence. What do you think? And of course, the only valiant soldier who left with the true spoils of war, not just information, who cares about that, we want the spoils of war, is of course Lord Momo. But like I said last time, that facade of confidence, that false confidence that Zhao has, is cracking. And Zuko knows, doesn't he? First, it will make him doubt Zhao's true competence and confidence, but eventually this will lead to him finding truer confidence later on. This is the breakdown that he needs before he can build himself back up, and the breakdown has only started. And did I mention how amazing some of these shots are? Just, God, the artistry with some of these. This is why I love this series. This is why I love it. Why is it so controversial to say that martial arts styles are extremely important to how bending works? Episode 9 is a perfect example of how the martial arts were utilized in the original show. This is going to be really useful in trying to find our grand unified theory of bending. But by the end of the video, I'm also going to slightly tie it into Legend of Korra with the pro-bending style and Bolin's lava bending. The episode starts with Aang kind of panicking about the ticking clock that they now have to deal with. So now we finally get to Aang learning some waterbending. Katara shows him how to push and pull the water, and keep in mind that waterbending is based on Tai Chi. And Katara is getting upset that Aang is getting it so quickly when it took her months to figure it out on her own. And that's the first point I really want to make here, is that she is getting these Tai Chi moves down, but so far as we know, there was no one to teach her, there were no waterbending scrolls, and she knew no other waterbenders. Katara taught herself, and simply by trial and error, she found very specific Tai Chi moves. At first, you could just chalk this up to aesthetic choice, but it's not aesthetic choice, and we'll see through the rest of the episode. Aang being kind of a bending prodigy is not the only reason that he gets it so quickly. Aang has been training in his martial art basically since birth, and Bagua Zhang is a very circular martial art just like Tai Chi. So it makes sense that waterbending is just natural to him. Imagine you want to learn multiple martial arts, and you started with Taekwondo, and then you move to karate. Now that's going to be a much easier move for you than moving to something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. These forms are already similar enough that he has an edge over Katara, who is doing this completely on her own, which is astounding that she got this good to begin with. But her coming up with these Tai Chi motions completely on her own lends credence to the idea that the martial arts themselves are integral to how bending works. And what I also find interesting, which I really hope was on purpose and not just a happy accident, but if you watch Katara's motions, she's smooth to a point, but you'll notice that she has very rigid hands. We can see her trying and trying and trying, but look at her hands and how strongly she's holding them. And compare that to Aang, who is loosely allowing his hands to move freely. When I was younger, I was in Tongsudo. Now, Tongsudo is a linear, hard style, if you want to use those terms. When I started Tai Chi, I had the benefit of having a very good Tongsudo teacher who helped me understand when to be tense and when to be relaxed. But even then, it was a learning curve going from a very hard Tongsudo style to something circular, smooth, and loose like Tai Chi. So Katara has the moves down, but she's trying to force it, and she's not going with the flow, which is what you need to do with styles like both airbending and waterbending. So when they steal the waterbending scroll, she's still trying to force it, and by forcing it, she is not going with the flow, and the flow doesn't go with her. So the water doesn't go in the direction that she's trying to aim it. We even saw that in the two-parter premiere, where when she tried to splash water forward, it always went backward. So she is upset when Aang shows her up. But once again, look closely at her hands. Her hands, back up here, her hands are like this, not like this. But when you see Aang, you can see him moving through the forms like that. So this all goes to show that in a vacuum, if you were to create bending from scratch by only having the power and trial and error, you will come to the same conclusions, the same style. We'll talk more about how that affects the grand unified theory of bending at a later date when we have a little bit more data to work with, but here's what it means for Korra. We can kind of compare pro bending to MMA. MMA is not its own specific style, it is a combination of styles, but you usually see two major things with it, a grappling style and a striking style, and it's rarely a single martial art that does both. But there are now MMA gyms that kind of teach that same hybrid, and so you can almost imagine it as a style because most people are using a combination of Muay Thai and BJJ, with a few other things intermixed in there. So you can think of this as almost a universal style. Whether you think it's better or worse than any other fighting style in the real world, that's immaterial. We can still, in this same way, consider it a universal style. Pro bending is similar in that you have the same kind of sportifying of the bending, and so they all kind of start to look similar no matter what element they're bending. But as we saw in this episode, your bending style is integral to your actual bending. So we saw how in the pro bending arena, Korra got some breakthroughs in her airbending style, but that doesn't answer the question. The most important question we have here is, what effect does the pro bending style have on her ability to bend? We see her using that same style with airbending the moment she gets it. So when we eventually come back to explore where Bolin's lava bending comes from, this is something we're really going to have to keep in mind, and I'm probably going to go frame by frame, but that's going to come much, much later, and hopefully I get through the rest of book 1 much faster than I have so far. So anyway, let me know what you think about how they use martial arts in the original show, and next time we're going to be talking about Pai Sho. We all love Iroh, we all love the White Lotus, but this has nothing to do with the White Lotus. Let me explain. Last episode, we talked about this waterbending scroll, which was stolen from this pirate. The bird's really important too, but I'll talk about the next video. In the beginning of the episode, Zuko's training is thrown off by the ship going completely sideways as they change course. And it turns out the reason they're changing course is because of Iroh. He's lost his White Lotus Pai Sho tile, and for anyone who has already seen the rest of the show, you know immediately that has to do with the White Lotus organization. So first and foremost about the White Lotus, they are a fraternity of philosophers, basically. Their roles change throughout the eons, and I know that there's some details from the previous iterations of it in other reading material that I haven't actually read, but in the time of the show, it's basically just, a fraternity for philosophy buffs. That being said, the White Lotus as an organization did not exist when they wrote this episode. Iroh losing the White Lotus Pai Sho tile is really just for comedic effect. So while there's no hidden message about the White Lotus organization, I think there might be a little bit of a hidden message about Iroh's true intentions, or possibly about destiny itself. Because how can they just go to port in a random place looking for a Pai Sho tile, with only a Sungi horn to show for it, and meet the exact same pirates? Pirates who, by the way, actually notice the weird clothing that they're wearing, unlike some unnamed Fire Nation soldiers from previous episodes. And this leads them on a chase for the Avatar. And while Zuko's insight is fairly smart, saying they took a waterbending scroll, they'll be on the water, it's also getting dark. Katara didn't have the itch to try out that waterbending scroll in the middle of the night. That line of logic would do nothing. They would just be here in camp, and maybe they would see the fire that nobody is watching, even though they're all asleep, which is, don't do that. But it just so happens that Katara steals the waterbending scroll. But just before she leaves, something interesting happens. Momo jump scare! Momo once again is fulfilling his role as kind of the personification of the correct path. This is not the path that Katara should go down, so he not only jump scares her, but he kind of judges her. But she does it anyway. And it shows right here, they have no idea where their camp is, so they're using her as bait. So his logic only works because destiny intervened. So since we know that Iroh the whole time had his Pai Sho tile in his sleeve, was this on purpose? Did he know where the Avatar was, but he wanted Zuko to have a win? Or did he maybe have a feeling that they needed to do something else? Was he in tune with the music of fate? Or is it all just happenstance? I mean, the only way I can think of this being just kind of random chance is that they are still tracking them, and so they would technically be in the relative vicinity of where the Avatar is because they've been tracking them for a while, but still. Iroh didn't really have his hands in his sleeves for most of this episode until he finds the Pai Sho tile, so it's reasonable to assume that he really didn't know it was there, but at the same time, it's also not reasonable with all the moving and flapping around that they do. So while maybe he didn't have concrete information, maybe Iroh, in all of his wisdom, is just a little bit more in tune with going with the flow of fate and had this feeling, maybe we should stop in port, let me give us a reason. Or I'm just looking too much into it again. Let me know what you think. Did you know Zuko had a hawk? And that hawk was Momo's arch nemesis. I just got this image from Google. At some point we will go over the actual unaired episode, but why is this relevant to episode 9? That's because even though they cut it out of the main show, this lizard parrot kind of fills the same role. And he was absolutely a nod to that hawk, and of course, Sokka also has Haki, which of course is another nod to that. Once Sokka has done his thing and cleverly played both sides against each other, the pirates decide to fight, not really to save the gang, but at the very least fight the firebenders. And of course, Momo gets involved in the fight, and we get our first look at this kind of mini rivalry they've got going on with the lizard bird. As Momo escapes with the waterbending scroll, the lizard parrot is not far behind. And let me just say, this fight scene has so many great moments in it. But one of my favorite parts is something that happens here when everything is covered in smoke. I understand that his tie is getting cut, and the barely missing of this spear is mostly for comedic effect, right? And that brings us back to that same old question. How much of this is cartoon logic? Because not long after that, we have Zuko barely dodging a sword swipe. So again, is it cartoon logic? Is it skill? Is it kinesthetic awareness? Where do we draw the line? And even when they're not fighting over the scroll, we still have parrot versus lemur. In writing, there's something called A story and B story, and the main fight is obviously the A story, and Momo's fight here with the lizard parrot is the B story. And in many cases, the A story and B story have something in common or something similar that kind of links them together for an episode. So even though this is mostly a nod to that unaired pilot, in a way, it's also Momo reflecting the true path of Aang and the gang. I'm reading too much into it again, aren't I? I can't help it. Momo's just too important. What did we learn last episode? We learned stealing is wrong, unless it's from pirates. In this episode, we meet Jet and learn about leadership. I could make a joke about messages and kids shows, but honestly, this is a really great exploration of what it means to truly be a leader. The episode begins with Momo moving the plot forward. After the gang frees Momo and the baboons, we get another look at how Sokka is intelligent, cunning, and knowledgeable. He notices right away that these are Fire Nation traps. And he notes this just by the craftsmanship alone. He is very intelligent and makes a very wise choice that maybe they shouldn't be flying around on Appa where they can report their location. And now we learn that apparently because his voice is still cracking as he goes through puberty, that means he can't possibly be manly enough to be a leader. Well, I'm the oldest, so I'm the leader. But honestly, I kind of feel for that because I went through this whole phase that I'm still getting over today where my voice kept getting higher pitched because people were thinking, one, my voice was fake, and two, I had a lot of customer service. And I had to always be smiling and happy, and over time my voice just got higher and higher as I was talking to people, and just, So if you'll notice, sometimes my voice is lower, and sometimes my voice is higher in videos. I am working on using my natural voice more. This is a great, funny way to show, though, that his heart is in the right place, but he's still a little immature. And when Katara says, well, shouldn't Aang be the leader? Come on. Even Aang knows he's just a silly little guy. And of course, Sokka having reasonable instincts that they have been tracked down before, there's Fire Nation in the area, maybe they want to go on foot at least for a little bit, they take this opportunity to make fun of him. Got a heavy bag? Why don't you give it to Sokka's instincts? Get bored and hate walking? Why don't you try Sokka's instincts? I was going to end that bit with like the super fast talk commercial like I'm really bad at that, so I'm just not going to try. But lo and behold, they run into the Fire Nation anyway. And it's at this point I want to mention that Sokka is a good leader. He has a lot of room to grow, but he is a good leader. He does have good instincts. He needs to learn what he's missing. Because this is used by Aang, Katara, and Jet to kind of crap on Sokka's leadership skills and his instincts. But isn't it better that they meet a group at a camp, take them by surprise, and take them out rather than them reporting it to, I don't know, Zuko, Zhao? So rag on Sokka all you want, I still think he made the right choice. Also, a quick thought occurred in this scene. So she's out there putting out fires with this water. That's their drinking water, right? Like, I know you can kind of, filter water when you're waterbending it out of something that is, dirty or muddy or something like that, but is she quite at that level yet? Like, are they going to have to filter that again later before they drink it? And right as Sokka's instincts just will a dart out of thin air and take out the lead guy, we meet Jet, and boy is he cool. Jet has all of the good qualities that Sokka is missing that would make him a better leader. While at the same time, all the things that make Sokka a good leader already, Jet is missing. But I'm going to end this here because that is going to take its own video entirely.